everybody. Welcome to another episode of Politically Depressed. As always, I'm your host, Eamon McAdam. So for the last week, there's been a lot of talk of war in Lebanon. Most recently, Nasrallah gave a speech, and it was quite an intense one. And there's been a lot of talk, a lot of discussions, a lot of sort of reports that suggest that a war is imminent. And it's not just all talk. There have been escalations at the border. But those escalations are still within what's described as the sort of rules of engagement that both parties have restricted their actions to. I think obviously Israel has pushed beyond that much more. But anyway, it's really fucked. I'm very nervous, I think like most people. But I want to spend some time to talk about it and to share my thoughts, because I've got a lot of thoughts. But also, the one thing that's kind of really puzzling me about all this, which is, what's the fucking end game here? Because the Israelis are picking a battle they cannot win. And it is a very suicidal mission, which, I mean, is not something that I'm very upset about, but I know the destruction that'll come with it. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk a lot about it. Obviously, the title, I've been titling my episodes very unambiguously, as in I just say it all in the title, but obviously there's more to it. So I'm going to talk about why it is just impossible, why Israel cannot defeat Hamas, why it cannot defeat Hezbollah, and therefore what is really going on in these calls for exterminating these groups, what is going on and what is the actual policy. What is de facto the policy? I don't know. I'm just going to talk about it. I'm realizing that I'm having difficulty starting conversations, so I'm just going to start it. But before I do have a few announcements. As always, this podcast is supported by listeners like you. You can support this podcast in a number of ways. One is to become a member of the Patreon. I'll put the link below. For as little as $5 a month, you can help support this podcast and get access to a lot of exclusive content, especially my sub-series, Keep This Between Us. But also, as a member, you get access to the monthly hangout, wherein we all get around once a month on a Zoom call and just talk a lot of shit and grieve mostly these days. There's also the tip jar for one-time donations. If you're unable to pay or to support financially, you can still support this podcast in a number of ways. You can leave a rating or a review wherever you listen to the podcast. You can tell your friends about it, post about us online, on your social medias, and help get the word out. Because the things I talk about are very relevant, but are still kind of niche. Because I'm not out here doing the usual bro analysis of geopolitics, whatever, that seems to be something that goes very far, which is beyond me. I mean, I understand it in terms of it's nice to think of it as a game, as a chessboard. I don't know, fuck it. It's like video game politics, in my opinion. But regardless, those are all the announcements. I've also decided to start doing a little bit of structure to these episodes. So I had that brief hook intro, did my announcements, and now I'm going to do something that I'm kind of calling headlines. They're not really headlines. It's definitely not going to be enough for like, this is your news for the day, but it's definitely things that are on my mind, things that I've come across that I can't get out of my head or I've been thinking about, but don't necessarily fit within the main body of the episode. So I'm just going to go through those now. Those fucking eyes. I don't know if people have seen this video of this young Palestinian man who was my age, who was just released from months of imprisonment and torture by the Israelis. And his eyes, he could not speak because of how pained he was, because of the levels of torture that he'd experienced. But in his eyes, you can see, like really genuinely reveals so much, but also reveals what we cannot ourselves see or understand or experience just by witnessing. That there are certain types of violence that are unseen. I mean, quite literally, this person was captured and held hostage by the Israeli state and tortured and just released, and he couldn't even speak. There's not much of what he says. It is in the eyes, and those eyes are just one of those many, many things that are kind of imprisoned within all of our minds for possibly the rest of our lives. It's haunting, but I think there are constant reminders that this violence is still ongoing, that we as people who are able to, we who are outside, need to do more, need to constantly escalate, need to constantly push ourselves to resist, to fight back, to put pressure, to organize, to protest. Anyway, aside from that, the assault on Rafah seems to just be going on as well. There's been this footage of before and after, and harrowing, and the constant displacement of people. I've kind of lost track of how many times people in Gaza have been displaced en masse. We're talking like 1 million, 2 million people moving from the north to the south and from Rafah to the sort of central areas and then back down. And it's just been dystopic as fuck. But that's something else that I'm constantly thinking about. And on top of this, Sudan, a commander in the RSF militia was killed, which was very good. But as a result, there's been a lot of sort of vengeance attacks on villages in the Darfur. And if I'm not mistaken, the RSF have also captured an important town in, I think, West Darfur, which is horrendous. I've talked a lot about Sudan on this podcast, but definitely not enough. I think we need to be talking so much more about it, because some of the numbers that are coming out of expected death tolls from famine, largely by the RSF, although the Sudanese army are also complicit in this, we're talking in the millions by September projected to die by famine, which is fucking atrocious, and just the horror, the absolute fucking horror of it all. And I don't know, a part of the reason why I don't talk much about it, I guess, is because everything feels so fucking useless. I'm still kind of impressed at myself that I'm still able to talk, because there's a constant thing hanging over my head, which is, what is the point of any of it? What is the point of raising awareness or talking about stuff or synthesizing or sharing histories? And it's all very cynical and nihilistic, which I am not, but the world is increasingly pushing me towards those conclusions. Anyway, I think the last thing I'll bring up as part of this sort of headlines section is that there's like 1,000 people estimated died by heat stroke or heat-related deaths during Hajj in Mecca. And that is just one of these stories that is going to become so regular as the climate collapse proceeds and continues to unfold, and we begin to actually witness what we've been talking about, like what I've been hearing my entire life for the last 20 years or so. I remember the first thing of it, 2006, The Inconvenient Truth. And now floods and wildfires are just the norm, and it's just going to get worse. And I don't know. This is something that I think about a lot on top of everything. I remember last year, 2 years ago, it was at the forefront of my thinking. And now, obviously, with the genocide in Gaza, with the potential war in Lebanon, obviously some of these things feel less immediate. But these are still things that are going to spell disaster for everyone, for the species. And this is another thing that I think people need to be more active with, which like compounds my feelings of fucking alienation being here. I think it's so damaging living next to a tourist attraction in Central Europe, because like, holy shit, when I step out of the house, just all these tourists, all these people going about their summer like there's nothing going on. Anyway, I think I need to change the name of this even conceptually from headlines, because I'm not able to do headlines in any conventional fashion. Because as soon as I open anything up, there's a flood that's like ready to go. I don't know. So for the last week, there's been really, really intense talk of expanding the war in Lebanon from the Israeli side, right? The Israelis for weeks now, even months, even years, have been talking about expanding to the north, about eliminating the threat posed by Hezbollah, about even reoccupying southern Lebanon. Like, let's not forget, within all of this is the actual expansionist idea of Zionism. They've never settled with their current borders, right? They want Gaza, they want the West Bank, and there are some extremist sort of movements that want part of Lebanon. They want, obviously, the Golan Heights, which is part of Syria. And I don't know, there's an image of this fucking IDF soldier with a badge that shows, greater Israel, but even greater than, like including parts of Saudi Arabia even. Because the idea of Zionism, the idea of what is the actual physicality of the state of Israel is not clear. There's no rule book for it. And so there's been a lot of talk, especially lately, of really expanding the war on Lebanon, really expanding the war against Hezbollah. And it's terrifying. All of us are incredibly anxious because we are talking about a nuclear-armed superpower that has crossed any conceivable red line. Anything that we've thought over the last few months that, yeah, it can only get so bad, but then someone, the adults in the room, will step in and stop it. None of it. The Israelis have gotten away with atrocious, atrocious war crimes that aren't just met with silence, but are applauded by large segments of the West. And the arms have not stopped flowing into it, and the diplomatic defense has not stopped. And so it seems like the next step that they are really gunning for is expanding their operations in Lebanon. So what'll this mean, right? There already has been a war in southern Lebanon for the last 8 months. And it's been a lot of tit for tat. There's been a lot of use of this term rules of engagement, because it is quite limited. Hezbollah could strike far deeper, could attack civilian targets, but they've really restrained themselves quite a lot. The Israelis too could push in much further, but they've sort of restricted just to sort of attacking certain targets here or there, limited airstrikes, artillery. They have committed war crimes already. They have been since the beginning, most notably the use of white phosphorus, killing aid workers, killing journalists, attacking civilian populations. But the main policy, the main tactic, the main war tactic the Israelis have been, it's not really a war tactic, but is ecocide. They have been for 8 months bombing the shit out of the south using white phosphorus, most recently using trebuchets, because the point is just to create fires, just to burn everything over there, because that'll mean that the population will not be able to return. Farmers in the south of Lebanon have really been impacted economically, and it's just an ecocide. They are literally making it uninhabitable for us, but also for the wildlife, for anything to live. And the main concept is we need to push them back, right? There's so much talk of the Litani River. The Litani River is a landmark for Zionism, right? There were some Zionists who, in the sort of imaginary of the greater Israel, some of the ideas of the northern border is the Litani River. I don't know, some biblical bullshit, but they're fucking crazy. Anyway, so they want to create a buffer zone. They are talking so much about the school year. I find it so fucking ridiculous that at a time that they're committing genocide, that they're sort of, even in the rhetoric, talking about the school year and wanting to return normalcy. There's so much bullshit And it's so hard to parcel through the noise, and especially when we've heard so much of this for years. I remember 10 years ago, Lieberman, this mad Israeli politician, was talking about, in our next war, we will send Lebanon back into the Stone Age or whatever. And there's been so much of this for years, and even recently, in the last few months. And so it's very difficult to really be able to compartmentalize what is saber rattling, what are just empty threats, especially in the context of pushing for a deal, this sort of quote unquote ceasefire deal that Blinken was calling the Israeli deal, but in reality, it's a capitulation deal. It's not a ceasefire deal. There's no ceasefire in the deal, and one of the main stipulations is essentially that Hamas will surrender completely. And no one's ever going to do this because they know what it means for themselves, but they know what it means for the population. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to concretely answer the question why Israel can never destroy Hamas and Hezbollah. And I think the answer is quite simple, because it helped create them. Not it helped create them, not as in it gave them a bit of money, it gave a bit of support, but it is precisely the violence and oppression that comes with Zionist occupation that has created these organizations, these militants, these forms of resistance. And there's no possibility that this thing can destroy the thing it created, because no matter what, it's like the Hydra. If the Israelis were to cut off one head, two will grow. Because what they really want to kill is the resistance to their domination. And that'll never happen, because people never get used to oppression. People never get used to occupation. There is always this constant need to resist and this desire for freedom. And I'm not saying these are beautiful, perfect organizations by a long shot. I am deeply opposed to Hezbollah as a political entity. But so in both cases, right, with Hamas was formed in the late 80s during the first Intifada, after 20 years of the Palestinian Revolution, in resisting and fighting for liberation against the Zionists. And same with Hezbollah. It grew out of the Israeli occupation of the South in the early 80s. It was originally a resistance group of just, ragtag group of guys who, were just literally resisting occupation. And they were in the forefront of the expulsion of the Israelis in 2000 with the liberation of the South. In the last 2 decades, story has been a bit different, but these are the origins of these groups. And Israel, over the last 2.5 decades, has not been able to curb their growth, their popularity. The opposite, by them continuing with the same exact brutal, violent, imperialist tactics, they constantly, Hezbollah has very good PR, but honestly, the best PR for them, or for Iran, or for anyone who claims to be in opposition to the state of Israel, the greatest piece of propaganda is the state of Israel itself. Let them do their shit, let them expose themselves, and, we don't really need to do anything. They're exposing themselves just as genocidal maniacs. But so, if there's not a change in tactics, if it's the exact same mentality and ideology and policies, they, as in the Israelis, can never defeat these organizations, or at least the concept of resistance. And the thing is, the Israelis know this. The spokesperson for the Israeli military came out and sort of criticizing Netanyahu and embarrassing him by saying, we cannot, also contradicting himself and being a fucking genocidal hypocrite, because only a few months earlier, in October, he was saying we can and will defeat Hamas. But now he's coming out and saying we cannot. Why? because it is not just a sort of a group of people, but it's an idea, it's a movement. And this actually is true in many ways. It is actually a political movement, but also it embodies and encapsulates the idea of resistance. Again, I'm not going to get into this thing. It's not the resistance. There is so many different forms of resistance and so many different groups that are engaged in resistance. But the point is, when the Israelis say, we want to destroy Hamas, what they're really saying is we want to destroy any form of resistance to us. That is impossible. That is not going to happen. And so, what are the Israelis doing to make that happen? They are killing everybody. This genocide, right, is not a result of a miscalculation that they want to destroy this group, but all this collateral damage, that is all bullshit. But rather, in their attempts to crush any resistance to their domination, or to put it differently, in order to maintain their grip, their domination, they are enacting genocide. And they want to push all these people out into the desert, or into the sea, or just to kill them, essentially. Which is essentially an acceleration of the already existing policy, right? Like, this isn't the first aggression on Gaza. This is obviously the most major and destructive one, but that has been the policy of the last 2 decades. Every year or two, they would go in and do, and I swear to God, I don't know if people know this, but what the Israelis would call mowing the lawn. Because essentially, the policy is to starve and besiege Gaza. And I think all along, the point is because they want to clear it out of its native population, whose sole crime is existing and constantly demanding in many different forms their right to the land, their right to resist occupation and domination and genocide. And that is very similar to what the Israelis are doing in southern Lebanon through this ecocide. They want to make the area uninhabitable because the only way to crush resistance to occupation, to genocide, to the settler colonial violence is to cleanse the place of all life, is to make it impossible to live there, is to remove the people in their entirety. And I really fear that is what they plan to do in Lebanon. In fact, I know this is what they're going to do in Lebanon, and this is why I am so fucking terrified of the prospect of an escalated war, of an expanded war, because there is no respect whatsoever for civilian populations or for the boundaries of international law. And we've seen this time and time again, especially in the last 8 months. And now it really does seem like the gaze is turning onto us. And I'm genuinely terrified. And I hope I'm going to be able to continue doing this and doing more. But ultimately, I am feeling really just burnt out. Like, what the fuck? What will stop the Israeli war machine, which now is not slowing down, is expanding? It's turning its gaze into a different arena completely. And it cannot. The cards are almost entirely with the Israelis. If they were to pull out of Gaza, if they were to agree to a ceasefire deal that the UN Security Council mandated months ago, that Hamas agreed to months ago, if they were to, I mean, obviously none of this is going to happen, but they could not. They could simply not. And they've really dug themselves into a hole, right? Netanyahu obviously knows, and part of this is a personal thing for him, that if he were to pull back, he would have to go. But I don't know. It's so fucked up. There are no adults in the room. There are no moral people in the room to, I don't know. What I do know is that an expanded war against Hezbollah will be devastating on Lebanon. It will also be incredibly devastating to the Israelis. And this used to be part of the calculation. There used to be some whatever from the Israeli government, from the Israeli state, of protecting their own fucking settlers. But not anymore. And they really seem like a suicidal, genocidal regime that is very willing to sacrifice its own population in pursuit of very unclear objectives. And I think that is precisely where we're at. And I think that is exactly where I'm getting to, which is this is beyond Zionism. This is beyond the sort of project of Zionism. I do believe Ian Pape when he says that we are witnessing the collapse of this project. And we are witnessing the devastating unfolding and imploding of this incredibly, incredibly violent structure. Something that was founded on genocide. Something that just every single day of its existence is premised on the constant dispossession and violence and domination of an entire people. And so in its moments of collapse, it is essentially floundering. It is essentially lashing out, but has lashed out to such an extent that it cannot go back, that it has crossed over that tipping point. The two things, the October 7th attack, which I think really destroyed a lot of this idea of safety, of power that the Israelis have, and they know it, that this was a breach of something that had been keeping the state together for 7-8 decades, which is their complete, control of these areas and domination and security. But also in the genocide that they've been enacting ever since, in this violence, that has increasingly made it a pariah state and is going to slowly lose more of its Western support. And all the propaganda that's kind of kept it afloat is waning and is harder to justify. And so either we are witnessing the collapse of the state of Israel, or we are witnessing the collapse of fucking everything. And I think that's the terrifying place that I see us in the region, but honestly in the world at. And this is what's at stake with the full invasion of Lebanon, with the expanded operations, is genuinely we are faced with a dichotomy with mutually exclusive options: the continuation of the status quo or survival. And again, I'm not speaking hyperbolically, but I mean for all of us. And in many ways, some of those precedents are set and have already been set. But a war against Lebanon will not be contained. It will be the turning point that is just, there really genuinely is no going back from this. And I know many will say that that's already happened with Gaza, and in many ways that's true, but this is also something else entirely. Hezbollah is a completely different beast. Invading a sovereign country is a completely different thing. The other groups that's going to get involved, God knows what Iran's going to do. But God knows what the West will do once Hezbollah really starts pulling its, arsenal, which it has very selectively been revealing. So all this is painting a really disastrous picture in my head, and I'm doing all I can to stay afloat and to not think too much about it, because as you can see, I've been thinking very apocalyptically. Who is going to come stop this? I am constantly waiting, because it really does not seem like there's anyone inside the Zionist entity that is going to step up, right? It does not seem like any of their Western imperialist backers are going to step up. I have very little faith in the so-called axis of resistance to meaningfully prevent anything or to create any actual changes in dynamics, But in terms of stopping this, of de-escalation, no idea. No idea. It's honestly terrifying. And I really hope that things cool down and we see an end to this violence and non-escalation of it. But I really don't see where that'll come from. My only hope, or my only ways of imagining that, feel very rested on a kind of willful optimism that I often can't summon in myself. But anyway, this has been another episode of Politically Depressed. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I hope you've been enjoying the readings that I've been doing, actually. I would love to hear back from anyone listening, any feedback, if you agree with me or disagree with me, or, I don't know, want me to read something specific or focus on a certain topic, interview a certain person. I would love to hear feedback and to hear back from all of you lovely listeners. And yeah, again, if you appreciate this podcast, there's the tip jar below, there's the link to the Patreon, and there's all my love and gratitude. So I'll see you all next time.